Why do I think we should act now? Because what the scientists tell me is that the longer we leave it, the more difficult it is to make a difference, the harder, the bigger the costs will be that the world faces. Now, what kind of effects are we talking about? We're talking about more flooding, I said that. We're talking about river flow reduction, because there'll be flooding in some places, but a reduction in water in others. We're talking about more heat waves. We have published projections for the UK, the climate impact projections produced by our world-respected meteorological office, which says that the 2003 heat waves, which we saw in Europe and killed 35,000 people, in 20 or 30 years' time will become much more normal. And if we don't act on climate change, in 50 years' time, will be normal. So we're talking about people dying in heat waves, and the costs of adapting to that. We're talking about droughts, and yet we're talking, about flooding in a big way. Nick Stern, the respected economist, has said that that we are talking in this about the world facing costs of between 5 and 20% of GDP, of gross domestic product, in 2050. 5 to 20% of our national income if we don't act. And he says that the costs of acting on climate change are something like 1% of national income, 1 to 2% of national income by 2050. So we can either lose 3 months or 6 months of economic growth for the world and act, or we face this huge risk in relation to the costs of adapting to climate change and climate refugees and a whole range of other scenarios that may happen. So I think there is a strong environmental case for acting now, because the sooner we act, the less the costs will be. But it's not just an environmental case, there's also an economic case. Because what businesses say to me in the UK is, if we are going to create these green jobs in making wind turbines, making solar panels, carbon capture and storage, all these new industries, we need much greater certainty than we have at the moment about what is going to happen to the price of carbon, the price that we are putting on carbon through the emissions trading scheme. And that's why we need an agreement at Copenhagen. That's another reason. So I think there is an environmental case and there is an economic case as well, because business needs the certainty in order to invest. And the other reason why I think we should act now is we have a moment of opportunity. We have President Obama in the United States, who's changed their position. We have China, where the president of China went to the United Nations in September last month and announced a change in Chinese policy on climate change. It's the first ever speech by a president of China to the United Nations, announcing a change in Chinese domestic policy, underscoring the importance of acting on climate change. India is moving as well. So I think we need to seize this moment. That's the why. Economics, environment, and the moment of opportunity. Secondly, I want to talk about the what. What do we need to seek from a Copenhagen agreement? The problem with Kyoto, which was the last agreement the world struck in 1997, was that it didn't involve every country, so the United States didn't ratify the treaty, and it didn't involve developing countries. And the truth about this, and I'm sure this is familiar to you, is that the only way we achieve what we have to achieve, which is to get carbon emissions for the world to start falling, not rising, is if we involve China and India and these other countries. That's the truth. There are in fact two truths in these negotiations. The problem has been caused by developed countries, particularly countries like the United Kingdom, in terms of the carbon emissions in the atmosphere, but looking to the future problems, the rise in emissions that we project will be caused by developing countries. So we need everyone involved in this agreement. We need cooperation on technology, because our former Prime Minister, Tony Blair, I think made a very important point. He said, where there is a way, there is a will. In other words, if you can show to people that there is a way of making these changes in their carbon emissions, then people are more likely to want to do it. That's why we need cooperation as part of a Copenhagen agreement on technology, like carbon capture and storage, like solar energy, like renewable energy, like biofuels, all the technologies that will make this low-carbon transition possible. And also, we need financial arrangements as well. And this is very difficult. Let me be honest about this. This is very difficult for developed countries in particular, who will face part of this challenge. And the question here is, do we think that developed countries have a financial interest or an economic interest in helping developing countries to adapt to climate change? My case to you is we do. Because if we act on our own, and developing countries like India and China and Brazil don't act, we won't solve the problem. So we will be good and green, and if they don't act, we will still face all the effects that I'm worried about and that President Klaus is less worried about than me. That's why I think we need to. That's why I think we need to act. Now, the question then is, why should we pay to help developing countries to make changes in their economies? For me, it comes down to a couple of things. First of all, historically, we are the problem. I'm not saying Poland is necessarily the problem. Speaking for the UK, we have a share of responsibility for the emissions in the atmosphere at the moment. And also, when we look at these developing countries like India, which has 450 million people who have no access to electricity and a similar number living on less than $1 a day, we can see that their levels of development mean that they need help. Now, I think it's really important to say to this audience in this country that we also recognize that that there are differences in developed countries. So a country like the UK can shoulder a bigger share of the burden than a country like Poland. And that is absolutely understood. And in my discussions with the Polish government today, that has been absolutely understood. That's why in the climate and energy package, which was agreed last June, there was a decision made to transfer resources to Poland as part of that agreement, recognizing the different circumstances that different European countries face. And it is right to say this because not every developed country is in the same position, and I completely understand that, and European solidarity is a very important part of Europe moving forward on these questions. So, the what, I think, is that we need reductions in emissions globally, and that means action from developed countries and actions from developing countries. We need cooperation on technology, and we need financial flows as well, and we need proper measurement, reporting and verification, or monitoring, reporting and verification of what countries are doing. Now, let me then finally turn to how. How do we get a deal? I suppose I've learned something about these negotiations in the last year, at times painful year, which is that conventional negotiations don't often get successful outcomes. We've seen that with the trade round, for example, the Doha trade round, 189 countries all negotiating. It's a recipe for a very difficult situation.